Now this video is a long time in the making and I am so excited for it. Now for those of you that have been watching my channel for a while, you know a lot about my story and the journey being a medical doctor now in my final years of residency and being in school for so many years. But what many of you don't know, unless you went to school with me, is that the entire time I have been just a giant nerd about studying medicine and learning a whole bunch of the different fun facts about it, and I regret absolutely nothing. The way I see it, when you decide that you're going to commit the next 10 to 17 years of your life in school to train for the job that you want to have, you better find something that you enjoy about the process itself. And for me, one of my favorite things that kept me interested in lectures and showing up day after day was all of the wild and crazy and just horrifying facts and stories about my profession that is medicine. Now, it was a couple weeks ago that I decided to take two of my biggest passions in my free time, those being Iceberg videos on YouTube and medical trivia, and merging them together to make hopefully one of the largest medical iceberg videos here on the internet. Now, for those of you that don't know the concept of an iceberg video and how that works, all you need to know is that when you look at an iceberg, many of you have heard this before, the majority of the iceberg is actually underneath the water. You just see the little piece on top. And that's how these videos work. You start off at the first level, and as we get further and further through these videos, we are going to be talking about increasingly interesting, complex, and in some cases, yes, horrifying facts about medicine. Like especially in the later tiers, we're going to be talking about gene editing and cloning and bioweapons and all sorts of really interesting topics. Now, the rules of my iceberg are pretty simple. I only have three. First thing you need to know is that everything that we're going to be talking about in this iceberg are all hard facts of medicine. These are confirmed to have happened. We will speculate every now and then, but we're not going to deviate into different theories, because the cool thing about medicine is that you really don't have to. You don't have to go outside the realm of what actually happened for things to get really wild really quickly. Rule number two is that the iceberg's large, but it's not all encompassing. I am trying my best to put as many different things in here as possible. I've arranged it in a 4-tiered system. If I'm missing anything though, feel free to comment in the comment section below what you want me to add, especially for the later tiers. And every single topic that we're going to be talking about could have an entire dedicated video. And in many cases they do. So I encourage everyone to look those up, especially if you're interested for a little bit more extended reading in anything that we're talking about. And the last thing is that we are going to be getting into some very difficult concepts, some more difficult than others for some people. And viewer discretion is advised for this video. If you don't want to hear about some of the most horrific things that have ever happened to the human race, you might want to come back to this at a different time, because it's not going to be all sunshines and daisies as the history of medicine goes, and some of you probably already know that. I'm going to change my language a little bit to try and keep this video up on YouTube. I don't want to run into any problems when that happens very quickly, but I don't want anything really to be off limits so far as that it is actually confirmed to have happened. And that's my disclaimer. I'm coming at this from a place of respect and sharing the history so that people could learn from it and hopefully get more interested to do more research themselves in the future. Okay, so that's it for disclaimers. In the future, we're not gonna have to go through this again for all the other tiers. Last thing I wanna say is that these videos are not sponsored. They're probably not gonna be monetized either by the time we get through with the list. I would really appreciate if you could like or comment on the video, leave me suggestions, show me if you thought that this was interesting, because it directly impacts the channel and how available I am to get these videos out in the future. Okay, so here we go, tier 1, and just quick disclaimer, I'm a nerd. This is really interesting to me. I wrote a little bit of a description in keeping with the typical iceberg format for every single tier that we're on. So here's tier 1, we're calling it the pre-med. The description says, you study hard, pull the occasional all-nighter to ace your exams, and pay attention in every class. But so what? So does everyone else. There's got to be something else though, something that you're not seeing, something that'll set you apart. While everyone else reads the textbooks, what if you start reading the lines in between the pages themselves? Study up and get used to it. It's a long rabbit hole and you're going to be here for a while. So we'll ease everyone into it with the fact that the 1949 Nobel Prize in Medicine was given to the lobotomy procedure, and to this day the Nobel Prize has not been revoked. Primarily because you can't really revoke a Nobel Prize once it's been given. But the lobotomy procedure, what it did was sever a part of the brain called the frontal lobe from the rest of the brain. And many of you know the frontal lobe is responsible for a lot of the higher order functions, such as planning and complex interactions between speech processes and thought. Now, this was a horrifying procedure that was estimated to have been done on tens of thousands of people, according to some estimations. and it was primarily used for the treatment of schizophrenia as well as a few other psychiatric disorders involving psychosis. Important to know though that we didn't have antipsychotic medications until the late 1950s. So this procedure was actually done before the treatment of antipsychotics later on, and at the time your other options were either electroconvulsive therapy or insulin-induced coma. Now, a lot of people actually think that you did the procedure by inserting a long instrument through the nose, and we would call that a transsphenoidal procedure. But in my reading, I actually saw that it was more likely done after a certain point through the eye, and they would go in through around the eye as a transorbital procedure and sever that part of the brain that way. Important to know that we don't do lobotomies anymore, but we do certain types of neurosurgery that is called stereotactic neurosurgery. This is only done if medications and other interventions fail, and it's done for a few different conditions. Stealing body parts, especially after an autopsy, was something that unfortunately did happen. But one of the most interesting cases of this happening, in my opinion, is the case of Albert Einstein's brain. Albert Einstein died in 1955 of an abdominal aneurysm, and after he died, one of the pathologists responsible for the autopsy, his name was Thomas Stoltz Harvey, out of Princeton, took out Albert Einstein's brain, cut it up into many different pieces, and actually ended up keeping most of those pieces in his personal possession. Many years later, we still do not have all of Albert Einstein's brain pieces back. Most of them have been recovered, and they are currently kept under lock and key, and I believe it's still Princeton University. Some of the other pieces are kept on display at a museum, but there are still pieces of Albert Einstein's brain floating around somewhere in the world in someone's collection, most likely. Now, here's the thing. I really don't get why, right? Like, I get it. Back in the day, Albert Einstein was largely known as like one of the smartest people to have ever lived, especially for his time. They wanted to study it and see if there was any differences between his brain and other people's brains. But nowadays, like, what are you doing with it? Are you showing it off when people come over for dinner? I really hope people haven't tried eating it, but you know there's got to be one piece of Albert Einstein's brain that someone's turned into a smoothie. Smoothie with Albert Einstein's brain. We're getting dark today. Sorry guys, this is where this is going. Next one, the Black Plague, the Bubonic Plague, the Great Plague, just plague. Yersinia pestis is the causative agent of plague, and it is definitely one of humanity's greatest kind of adversaries ever. It is the single greatest loss of life per percentage that we've ever experienced in our entire history from a single organism that we are aware of. And it's still around today. A lot of people don't know that, but especially you could see it in Africa and Asia, and even in the United States, especially the western areas of the United States, like New Mexico. Thankfully though, we have treatments for it now, but you still do get people that present to the hospital with plague every single year in the United States, responds well to fluoroquinolones like levofloxacin. Viruses are not alive, and I think that's a concept that many people kind of struggle to understand what that means at first. When you look at the tree of life and how that branches off, you have your animals, you have your plants, you have your fungi. Those are your multicellular organisms. But then when you get into the single cellular organisms, basically what you're looking at are your protozoans, your bacteria. Viruses don't fall anywhere on that, and they also fail most of our definitions as to what life actually is. For example, they don't actually use their own cellular machinery to reproduce, which is probably one of the most basic definitions of what it means to be alive. Now, this one's really interesting, I think, because this is very contentious in the field, with different biologists arguing different sides of the point, and maybe there are some viruses that do have cellular machinery that might act as exceptions to the rule for the most part, but I think the bigger picture here is that viruses are dangerous. They are responsible for thousands, if not millions of deaths every single year, and people have a tendency to humanize things that are personally attacking them. You could look at examples like Osmosis Jones and other things seen in literature and media about humans trying to ascribe human qualities to things that attack them like viruses, even though they're not technically alive. Cloning is an old science, and this is going to be probably the first time in the Iceberg that we're going to see that you're going to come across some concepts that we're going to set up in Tier 1 that will continue to advance as time goes on. Cloning, as you think about it, is a technology that has been around for decades at this point. We've made great advancements, but this goes back at least to the first ever technical cloning experiments that were done in the late 1800s. The very first breakthrough in cloning technology technically goes back to 1885 when Hans Adolf Dreich did a first experiment where he proved that by taking a sea urchin zygote, which is technically a single cell that all other cells will come from later on, and by shaking it very vigorously, you could have two very separate organisms develop from one single zygote if you split that one single cell, and that forms as the foundation of everything else that we're going to talk about for cloning later on. Now, this one hits a little too close to home right now, but the father of American surgery and also the person credited as developing the residency program in the 80-hour training weeks in medical residency here in North America was, by all accounts, addicted to cocaine. William Stewart Halstead was a surgeon that practiced in the late 1800s, and early on in his research, accidentally, by some accounts, became addicted to cocaine. This was a problem that he tried to reconcile later on by going to rehab and trying to receive treatment, but there are many articles like this one over here called "Necessity is the Mother of Invention: William Stewart Halstead's Addiction and Its Influence on the Development of Residency Training in North America," that goes into how he created this system of training, because as you progress further in your residency training, you train the people underneath you, and he used this system so that the residents underneath him could also go ahead and take some of his responsibilities while he tried to hide his addiction. By some accounts, Dr. Halstead was said to have an incredible work ethic and could stay awake and perform work for incredibly long periods of time, and demanded that his residents were also able to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you're wondering how he was able to pull that off, and maybe you can't, maybe cocaine. Sometimes doctors still prescribed exorcisms even to this day. And we just talked about how in the past, our understanding of mental health and psychiatric disorders was definitely not the best. However, after 1999, the Catholic Church made it mandatory that all exorcisms that are to be performed by an exorcist need to first be cleared by a psychiatrist to make sure that this is not simply just a case of mental illness. There is a board-certified American psychiatrist who I believe teaches at Columbia University, was interviewed by CNN in the past. I've never talked to them before. There's an interview with them stating that although they believe that it is rare, there are instances where they feel like a exorcism was required to treat that patient more so than they could as a psychiatrist. Now, there are some very specific criteria as to when a psychiatrist might refer someone to have an exorcism, and most of those have to do with symptoms that are way outside what you would see in usual psychosis. Feats of extraordinary strength, throwing people off the bed, and they don't have the body frame to be able to do that. Speaking in languages that they couldn't possibly have known, like Latin or some of the older languages, or having in-depth detail and recollection about historical events that once again they could not have possibly have known. Now, this one is another really controversial one because we know that there are exorcisms that happen that are not sanctioned to this day and probably don't need to be done at all. We are seeing that in the United States, the need for exorcisms continues to go up every single year. Many of them are very likely inappropriate, but I thought it was really interesting to know that there is a course offered by the Vatican that actually teaches priests how to perform exorcisms. It's about a week long from my reading. For this next one, if you are one of my patients that I see personally, just skip this one altogether, but this is all about the health benefits of smoking, not harms. There are some actually recognized and currently being researched benefits of smoking cigarettes, unfortunately. You have to admit though, it is really, really cool, like knowing the fact that smoking cigarettes is the only environmental exposure known in pregnancy to decrease the risk of gestational hypertension and preeclampsia. Now, smoking cigarettes is not good in pregnancy, but it is an observation that we've noticed. In addition, smoking cigarettes is also currently being looked at in its applications for Parkinson's disease, especially when it comes to the nicotine, as we've made observations in literature where people who smoke cigarettes on average might have a delay in onset for Parkinson's disease and also might have a overall decrease in some of the symptoms associated with it. Having said that, smoking cigarettes is bad for you, don't do it, cancer, all these other things. You don't want to kind of cherry pick data here, but really interesting to know about the possible health benefits in some cases. Botox, like the toxin that we use to inject in people's faces to reduce wrinkles and for a few other medical applications as well, is actually one of the most toxic naturally occurring compounds that we know of, where it is estimated by some people that a single gram of evenly dispensed micronized Botox is probably enough to kill about 1 million people by calculations. Now, the way this works is that Clostridium botulinum is the bacteria that produces botulinum toxin. Botulinum toxin has 8 different subtypes, of which typically for Botox that we use cosmetically, we only use 2 of those subtypes, A and B, and we use it in very, very low concentrations, which is why it doesn't kill people. Having said that though, it is still 2 of the 8 subtypes of one of the most toxic compounds that we've ever discovered naturally occurring. Now, this next one, I actually thought about putting higher up on the tier list for a while because I feel like many people should probably know it, especially if you've been to medical school, but they don't. On the screen, I will have 2 different symbols that many of you will recognize as some medical symbols, but only one of them is technically the correct one, and it's this one. So here's the confusion between the two. The rod with the one snake is known as the staff of Asclepius, and Asclepius was known way back when as the Greek god of healing, but the mythology actually goes even further behind that, as accounts from the Bible depict Moses, after leading the Israelites in the desert for 40 years, having stabbed a snake with his staff, and then therefore everyone that got bit by the venomous snakes in the desert simply needed to look at the staff and would get healed as a result. The second symbol, on the other hand, is called the caduceus, and that mythology goes back to, I believe, Hermes, and had to do with thieves and messengers. I believe it was first used by the Royal Medical Corps in the Army in the United States. However, a survey done in 1990 found that 62% of professional institutions do use the rod of Asclepius, which is what it's supposed to be according to mythology. And that one there is just like an obnoxious fact. Like, if you ever saw someone with a tattoo that had the two snakes and they have a medical background, you can, number one, point out that they're wrong, or number two, pretend you never saw this fact, put your hands in your pockets, and carry on with your day. HeLa cells are human cells that are immortal, meaning that it has been more than 70 years since the death of the person that they were first taken from. And to this day, there are still HeLa cells located in labs all over the world. The story goes back to Johns Hopkins Hospital. Henrietta Lacks was a patient with cervical cancer who, prior to her death, had some doctors, without her knowing, scrape some cells off of her cervix. They later found out that these cells were a little bit different than normal cells. And normally in human cells, what happens are cells divide, they grow, and then they die. And one of the reasons why is because the telomeres, which are little sections at the end of chromosomes in cells, tend to get a little bit shorter with every successive generation that goes by. But in cancer cells, this doesn't always happen, and in HeLa cells, they didn't happen, which is why they are still around even to this day. And it's one of the most important scientific discoveries in terms of cancer research, especially at its time. But this goes in a whole bunch of different directions now, because the cells were taken without her knowledge. And at the time, Johns Hopkins Hospital claims that they didn't sell any of these cells. They just gave them to different labs, but those labs then used them to create a whole bunch of different technologies that made millions or billions of dollars. And the family of Henrietta Lacks claims that they were never compensated for it, up until 2021, where they actually filed a lawsuit and were given an undisclosed amount of money for the legacy of Henrietta Lacks. And it was a very big deal at the time. It is known to set a precedent moving forward in terms of what happens to body property that was taken and was used for scientific discoveries. According to Johns Hopkins, for those of you that wanted to know, over the past several decades, HeLa cells have been used in research on zero gravity in outer space, as well as the development of the polio and COVID-19 vaccines, as well as to study leukemia, the AIDS virus, and cancer research worldwide. For the next one, we have scopolamine, or as some people call it, devil's breath, which is probably one of the most versatile medications that I've ever come across before. Different people know scopolamine to do different things. If you are a scuba diver or go fishing on boats or spend any time on boats ever, really, you're probably familiar with anti-nausea or motion sickness medication. The actual name of the drug is called scopolamine. That's one of the uses of scopolamine. People that do palliative care also use scopolamine to help with what's called the death rattle. That is because scopolamine is an anticholinergic medication that helps to decrease secretions in the back of the neck. Some people, however, especially in South America, have been rumored to use scopolamine, and they call it devil's breath, and that natural occurring form that grows in some of the vegetation down there, to zombify people, for lack of a better term. There are reports out of certain places in South America where people will take scopolamine, crush it up, mix it with a few other drugs, and will throw it or blow it in someone's face, or mix it with liquids and use it as sort of like a chloroform type of mechanism where they put it over people's faces. And what it is rumored to do is make people very increasingly suggestible and will listen to people no matter what they say. You have reports about people that blow some devil's breath in someone's face and then have them go into their bank and take out money to give to them. You have some people use it in order to help kidnap people as well. There are conflicting reports about how much of this might actually be the case, but most definitely you could find documentaries on YouTube about people talking about their fear of individuals that use scopolamine for all sorts of bad things in certain parts of the world. Blue zones are places in the world where there is an abnormally high number of their population who reaches the age of 100 and becomes what we call a centenarian. Now, there are a few of these places in the world. You have Okinawa in Japan, there's Sardinia in Italy, there's Icaria in Greece, and there are many different people there who tend to live to 100 years old for a few different reasons, but there are a few things that seem to have tied the threads together. There are definitely genetics that play a component to this, especially when you have these small little island nations, for the most part, where people with these genetics that allow them to live longer, more so because they are not susceptible to cancer, heart disease, or a few other of these genetic factors that might kill you earlier on. And therefore, if you have good genes in that sense, you could also live a little bit longer from a genetic standpoint. However, in addition, they've also identified factors like close social communities and family ties, a healthy diet, and daily physical activity. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, full name of the study going to be up here on the screen, was an experiment conducted by the American Public Health Services that lasted about 40 years with the original intent of trying to uncover whether or not the course of syphilis was different in Black Americans compared to white Americans. Now this one's just bad and all kinds of racist all the way down to the bottom. Basically what they did was, well, actually, before we even get there, the experiment was only supposed to last about 6 months, but ended up going for 40 years until a lawsuit was exposed by, I believe, the Washington Star that brought it to the public attention. In any case, they took a whole bunch of people, some with syphilis, some without. They didn't tell anyone that they had syphilis, by the way, and they watched to see what would happen with untreated syphilis. And for those of you that don't know, syphilis progresses from primary syphilis to secondary syphilis and eventually tertiary syphilis, which is fatal. And then even when penicillin was developed in the 1940s, patients were denied this treatment, even though we did know that it was going to be able to treat them and cure them. So in total, you had more than 100 people die from these experiments. They were originally supposed to last 6 months. And I believe the only payout that was ever issued was $10 million. I could be wrong about this, but if it was $10 million adjusted for inflation, this was given in 1974, that would be the equivalent of about $77 million in today's currency. Now, in my research, I didn't know this before, but there was also a separate set of experiments that was led by one of the doctors who helped out with the Tuskegee syphilis experiments called the Guatemala syphilis experiments. And it seems like the rationale at the time for all of these experiments about venereal diseases was to help treat soldiers that contracted venereal diseases after engaging with prostitutes after the war or during the war. While we're talking about syphilis though, we might as well talk about the fact that syphilis was probably the reason why the powdered wig in the 1700s, also known as the peruke, became a staple of fashion, especially after it was adopted by royalty. What I left out in the previous example on my iceberg is that syphilis in its later stages doesn't just kill you quickly. Primary syphilis, so its earliest stages, could often be denoted by a painless genital canker. So it looks like a round lesion somewhere in the pubic area, and it's typically without pain, but eventually that goes away, and then you develop secondary syphilis, which could have a few different manifestations. Sometimes you can't even tell that you have it at all. Sometimes you have shivers and chills and fever, but eventually tertiary syphilis, also known as neurosyphilis, could kill you in a few different ways. As it pertains to wigs though, one of the things that you see with tertiary syphilis in some cases are the development of gummas, which are these areas of necrosis that show up in different parts of your body. Basically, you can see some pictures I'll put up on the screen. It's like a central spot where the flesh looks like it's peeling away. And those tend to show up on the head, could also present with loss of hair, and in some cases actually get so bad and so necrotic that you could see down through the tissue and see the bone as well. Now, in the 1700s, there was thought to have been an explosion of venereal diseases, sexually transmitted infections, but especially syphilis. And if you were royalty that had these sexually transmitted infections and tertiary syphilis with the gummas that made your hair fall out, that's when people decided to start wearing these powdered wigs to cover things up, and that's why they became so widespread in popular culture even today when we look back at the 1700s. And the last extension of this syphilis iceberg kind of stretch we have here is the treatment for syphilis being penicillin, which was discovered by Alexander Fleming entirely by mistake, totally by accident, and in doing so, this one accident probably saved the lives of millions of people and drastically changed the course of history. Now, this story has always been one of my favorites. It shows us how just a small accident, one flap of a butterfly's wings someplace in time, could have drastically changed everything as we know it, and you're going to see that in a second. But as the story goes, Alexander Fleming was the resident bacteriologist, or he was in-house bacteriologist at St. Mary's Hospital in 1928. He went away on vacation, he came back, and there was a petri dish where he was growing Staphylococcus aureus. However, when he came back to look in the dish, there was some mold that had contaminated his samples. It was a Penicillium mold. And when he went to go look in the petri dish, the area around where the mold had infected was clear from any Staphylococcus bacteria, meaning that this fungus was producing a chemical that was stopping the bacteria from growing in that part of the petri dish. Now that's not all, because then Alexander Fleming, having noticed this kind of finding, thought that it would be a good idea to try and purify penicillin from the mold and see if it had any applications. So he enlisted a whole bunch of chemists, they were all experts in the field, to try and purify this penicillin from the mold that was producing it, and they concluded that it was impossible. They weren't able to do it, and they kind of just benched the entire project for about 10 years, until 1937, when the Penicillin Project took a look at some of Alexander Fleming's earlier findings in an effort to see if they could once again purify the penicillin compound. In 1940, the first ever animal trials were done with mice, where they successfully cured 4 mice from a deadly bacteria, and then from there, the first ever patient was treated with penicillin in 1942. This time frame coincides almost perfectly with World War II, and as a result of penicillin, millions of soldiers fighting on the battlefield were able to recover from previously fatal injuries as a result of infection, and totally just altered the branch of medicine where if penicillin wasn't discovered and synthesized and given to soldiers, by all accounts, we probably would have invested more heavily in sulfa drugs and those branch of antibiotics. The Barber Surgeons of the Middle Ages refers to the fact that in the Middle Ages, physicians actually didn't perform the surgeries themselves. There was a big growing divide between people that practiced medicine and people that did surgery. And performing surgery wasn't really a prestigious thing to do at the time, and as a result, all of the surgeries were either done by a priest or a barber. This was until about the 13th century, where a papal decree was passed and priests were no longer able to perform surgery, and as a result, all of the surgeries from amputations to hernia repair to bloodletting were all done by the barbers. This also worked out really nicely because all of the monks had to maintain their tonsure, and if you've ever seen pictures of monks that have the hair around the outside and are bald in the center, this was a sign of their devotion, and a barber had to do that for them and shave the center. So all of the different monasteries hired a single barber, and sometimes multiple barbers, to perform the haircutting, as well as all of the surgeries and other procedures. The last part of this is that when you look outside of barber shops even today and you see that column with the swirling different lines, this was thought to be representative of the bloody rags that were hung outside of a barber's office. The history of the opioid crisis. Take 1. Morphine was first synthesized in Germany in 1803, and at the time was dubbed God's very own medicine as a result of its safety, efficiency, efficacy, and everyone was a fan of it. Fast forward a little bit further into the 19th century though, in the United States, what you saw was a predominance of things called elixirs, which were liquids containing opioids in them, like morphine, that were used and prescribed by doctors for a variety of different things, including pregnancy pain, menstrual-related symptoms, depression, children's toothaches, and basically anything else that you could possibly think of. And if you think that I'm kidding, I promise the scary part is I'm really not. For headaches, gastrointestinal problems, acute physical trauma, the list really just goes on and on. Whether it was an elixir or a hypodermic needle, opiates were a wonder drug at the time, and we're going to talk a lot more about this later on. Now, the next one is prion diseases, and if you thought that bacteria and viruses were scary, I promise you that prions are much, much worse. Prions or prions, however you choose to pronounce it, they're scary, and the reason is because they're definitely not alive, and they're a force of nature, and they kill indiscriminately. There is no cure for prion disease, but let's back up a little bit. Basically what a prion is that it is a misfolded protein, usually pretty much always in the brain, that infects other proteins around it and causes them to become misfolded as well. But it's not alive, it's not intentionally doing it, it is something that happens and causes a chain reaction to all of the other proteins around you, and as a result, people that are infected with prion diseases get something called spongiform encephalopathy, where the brain and nervous system tissue develops a sponge-like appearance, which is where it gets its name from. So with this tier, we'll keep it simple. First thing you need to know is that there's no cure for prion disease. You got one, it will kill you eventually. It's only a matter of time. The second thing is that it spreads usually by consuming infected tissue from another organism that has it. For example, eating the brain matter of someone who is also infected with a prion disease. A good example of this is kuru, or laughing fever, which was first described in Papua New Guinea among certain members of the tribal inhabitants there. Now, kuru gets its name because when these people were first observed by researchers, people that were infected, there's 3 different stages of kuru. And in the first stage, you have this gait instability, problems walking, maybe some tremors for the most part. But in the second stage is when you see that these people develop total emotional instability and laughing for absolutely no reason that basically continues all the way up until they reach the a third stage, which is the fatal stage. They typically don't make it out of that. Usually start to finish, from when symptoms first show up, life expectancy is somewhere between 3 months and 2 years. And I cannot think of a worse way to die. And to observe that, especially like if it's one of your family members, just watching them total emotionally break down and laugh all the way up until basically the point of death must have been horrible. Endocannibalism in this tribe was stopped in the 1960s once they found out that this was probably not a good idea and that they were spreading it from eating the infected brain tissue. But one really interesting thing to note is that prior to this, in this culture, eating of the brain was thought of almost like a rite of passage for the deceased person into the afterlife. And usually it was the women and children that would consume the brain tissue, as they were thought to be the ones strong enough to handle the spiritual energy. Food deserts are a pretty easy concept to understand. Basically, it refers to the fact that in some inner city communities, we're talking urban areas, you have populations of people with many different options for food around them, but it's all fast food. It's not good quality food. There's no options available for foods that are low in carbohydrates or low in trans fats, and as a result, you have a population of people that are having a very hard time trying to access healthy food, even though at first glance it looks like there are so many options to choose from. The Human Genome Project, I think, is actually a high-level thing, but we need to do it here in Tier 1 to explain all the crazy stuff that comes after this. And I think a good place to start is with a concept called the central dogma. Basically, in molecular biology, we have a theory called the central dogma, which means that all of the transcription and translation and all of what actually happens with DNA moves in one direction. We go from DNA to RNA to proteins, and that's how gene expression typically works. Now, humans, on average, have 46 chromosomes. Those are pairs of 23 different chromosomes, where we have 22, what we call autosomes, and then a pair of sex chromosomes. Now, the story of the Human Genome Project goes back to 1990, where a group of scientists first came together in order to map out all of the genetic material that is laid out in our DNA. Now, this is important for many different reasons. There are wide-ranging applications for genetic research, but one of the most important ones for medicine is that we have a whole category of diseases that you don't catch from bacteria or viruses. They're not even prions or fungi. They're genetic, meaning that something encoded in your DNA is making you sick. And really, if you don't know what that DNA is, you will never have a chance to come up with a treatment for it. So in 1990, a group of these scientists come together with this goal, and they say that they're going to get this done in 15 years, and it's going to cost them $3 billion. And they thought this was a very ambitious goal, but they were pretty sure that if they worked hard and pooled all the resources together, that they'd be able to pull it off. And then 7 years later, a private company approached them named Celera, led by an individual named Craig Ventnor, who was a very interesting character in his own right, that said that they were going to be able to do the entire project themselves in only 3 years' time for a fraction of what that group was spending on doing the entire project. Now, in the scientific community, we call those fighting words. But the thing was, Celera had the results to back up their claims, and it turns out that Celera took a little while to get started, and in the end, they were actually able to tie the Human Genome Project and complete the task in a much shorter amount of time. Absolutely. But they both finished at exactly the same time with comparable results. They were both correct. Celera just did it technically faster. For the first time in history, the human genome was laid out in its entirety in 2003 after spending billions of dollars and about 13 years from start to finish from when the first group started. The entire thing could be done nowadays in only a couple days' time for a fraction of the cost. And that just shows you how much advancements have been made in this field and where we're going to be going when we start talking about gene editing and designer babies. Mass hysteria and social contagions as a concept. Basically what this means is that other than pathogens and other ways of spreading diseases, we see that there are sometimes really strange behaviors that starts with a single person and spreads to a crowd of people that are around them. A good example that's probably one of the most famous is the case of the meowing nuns, which happened in France, where one day, for apparently no reason at all, one nun began to meow. And this continued for a short while until other nuns around her continued to meow, and this eventually spread throughout the convent until eventually soldiers were called in who then whipped and beat the nuns, and they still continued to meow for some period of time before eventually stopping. Another example that I find really interesting, having a family that comes from southern Italy, is an example called tarantism. Now, in the Italian culture, we have a song and a dance called La Tarantella, Many of you have definitely heard about it before. You could look it up on YouTube, but historically, this might possibly be referring to a form of dancing mania, which was in some cases relatively common in Europe between the 16th and 17th century, where we had these sort of social contagions where sometimes for no reason at all, people would start dancing, the behavior would spread uncontrollably, and in some cases, people literally danced until they died, and we still don't really know why. Now, I bet some of you didn't see this one coming either, but this one's actually a setup as well for later things that we're going to talk about, because according to some experts, we might currently still be dealing with social contagions in many different forms in today's society. And finally, the last item on tier 1 of the iceberg, and probably one of the most important, is the story of Dr. Ignaz Semmelweiss and childbed fever. Now, the year was 1846, and Ignaz Semmelweiss was in a new school of physicians. This was a new school of thought that said that all doctors, physicians, should have scientific background in their training. Prior to this new area of thought, it wasn't really known to understand the scientific process, and many of the diseases that were spread at the time were thought to be from bad airs and what they called the miasma theory. Now, when Dr. Semmelweis was working in Vienna, he was stationed at a hospital that had 2 different maternity wards. One maternity ward that was staffed exclusively by midwives, and another that was staffed exclusively by doctors and medical learners. He noticed something that was pretty surprising to him almost right away, and that was that the maternity ward that was staffed exclusively by doctors had a death rate for new mothers from this thing called childbed fever that was 5 times higher than the station that was staffed exclusively by the midwives. Now, after making this observation, Dr. Semmelweis wanted to find out exactly what was going on, and he employed, really for the first time in modern history, the scientific method in a major academic center at the time, which was this hospital. He made the observation and then he hypothesized some different ideas as to what exactly was going on. He thought that maybe it was the position that the women were laying when they gave birth to children. He thought that maybe it was possibly something to do with the priests and the ringing of a bell when someone died that scared certain women afterwards and they developed the fever after that. But his final clue was when he noticed that one of his friends, who was a pathologist, had pricked his finger while doing an autopsy, caught something similar to childbed fever, and then died shortly afterwards. His new hypothesis then was that the maternity ward staffed by the doctors had a death rate that was so high because these doctors would perform autopsies on people that had previously died of childbed fever, not wash their hands, bring these pathogens, he didn't know what they were at the time, to new expectant mothers, and would then get them sick, and then they would die as a result. Conversely, midwives wouldn't do autopsies, and as a result, that's why the people on that side weren't dying as frequently. So Semmelweis comes in with an intervention. He had all of the people who were doing autopsies wash their hands with some sort of chlorine mixture in an effort to get rid of whatever these unknown pathogens were, and as a result, a lot less people started dying because people started washing their hands. This was someone that for the first time came up with an actual intervention as simple as washing your hands. It could have saved thousands, if not millions of people, but no one wanted to hear it at the time. The doctors that weren't washing their hands didn't want to believe that they were the people that were actually killing new and expectant mothers, and Semmelweis didn't really have much tact either. He became angry, and if people didn't listen to him, he was confrontational, and as more time went on, he became angrier and probably a little bit strange in his later life. Some people suspect maybe he had syphilis or a few other complications as well. In any case, he was eventually committed to an insane asylum at some point in his life, and it was suspected that he was beaten there and died of sepsis, with none of his colleagues understanding or wanting to listen to his theories. To me, the story of Ignaz Semmelweis has always taught me that no matter how conflicting someone else's idea might be with what I currently think is the right thing to do, we should hear them out. And I don't think that silencing people's voices is the right way to go about things, especially if they have sound logic. And that's one of the many stories in history that's shown us that. And that is tier 1 of the medicine iceberg. We're only at the surface. I promise you, there is all sorts of wild stuff still to come. And many of these things, I feel like a lot of people know. Okay, the video's done now. If you've watched it this far, first of all, thank you so much. Like, really, I know my girlfriend will watch this far, but I don't know who else is gonna make it to this point in the video. But thank you for if you did stick around that far. But in any case, everything that comes from this point on will be expanded topics that build off of a lot of what we talked about here, and some things that you probably will have never heard before. A lot of these require some really in-depth research and just knowing where to look and what to actually look out for when you first get into them. I'll say as well that a lot of these topics, so the tier is named the pre-med, and it's because a lot of these things you will first encounter if you took biomedical science and you're going through the medical school pathway. You hear about a lot of these things in like Bio 1 or Bio 2 or like microbiology in 3rd or 4th year. These concepts come up and you research them a little bit more, but it's just the tip of the iceberg, as the name implies. I don't know how many of you were able to tell, but this is day 2 of me filming. I think the first day I filmed for like 3 hours super late at night because I'm doing doctor stuff during the day, and then I'm studying step 3's coming up, and I'm trying to get all those questions done as well. But this is something that I was really passionate about, so I started filming at like 11 o'clock. I filmed from 11 to 2 a.m. and then this is day 2 now. Put the shirt back on, definitely need to wash. And then I'm gonna go to sleep after all this. But all this to say that, you know, if you guys like the video, feel free to put a comment saying that you liked it. I really appreciate seeing that when people are passionate about this stuff too, or if you like, you know, a resource that I put together, like the video, and please let me know other things that you want to see on the iceberg. Like, I have the list made up already, but it's flexible. We'll definitely put other things on there if you know something that I don't, because that's more than possible. Medicine has been around for ever, basically, and when we're talking about all of the things that could possibly show up on here, the list is essentially limitless. So last time I'll say thank you everyone for watching today's video. Hope you enjoyed it. We will see you all in the next one. Have a great week. Happy Thanksgiving to the Canadians out there. See you all in the next one. Everyone take care.